Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for attending this talk. Today, I'm presenting some data about race and dehumanization. If you wanted to see this slide or the paper itself, you can use the links described here. And for all of the studies, we pre-registered our study, and the data code and results can also be found in the link right here. All right, and before I talk about the paper itself, I wanted to say a few words about myself and who I am. So I study race and politics, and I study these things in three different angles. One look at the role of ideology and values, one look at the role of demographic shift, and one look at the role of methodology. So if you're interested in the type of question that I study, feel free to send me an email and I'll be happy to chat. Back to the dehumanization paper. Humans are born to be human, but we're not perceived to be equally human. Dehumanization refers to the denial of one's humanity, or when one is perceived to be less than human. And the dehumanization literature has identified two forms of dehumanization. One is the animalistic dehumanization, which occurs when one is perceived to be similar to animals and perceived to be lack of traits that are unique to human. And in contrast, the animalistic dehumanization, the mechanical dehumanization can occur when someone is perceived to be similar to a machine or to be lack of what is about the human nature. And members of stigmatized racial and ethnic groups are especially susceptible to dehumanized perceptions. And the degree of dehumanization can range from inconspicuous subtle to overtly blatant. Nevertheless, most of these prior literature do not distinguish the two forms of dehumanization that I just mentioned above. And the research on the blatant dehumanization in particular has primarily relied on the operationalization of the animalistic type of dehumanization. Now, among these studies, for example, research by the Goff and colleagues revealed that participants explicitly described Blacks to be similar to apes. Using a scent of a man scale, Nortelli and colleagues show that participants are willing to indicate that some social groups are more evolved, like a prototypical modern human, and they are American, European, Japanese people, and Swiss people. And on the other hand, some people are rated to be not so similar to the evolved human, and they are Arabs, Mexican immigrant, and Muslims. These predominant operational focus on the animalistic aspect of dehumanization invites two implicit assumptions about race and dehumanization. The first is that the animalistic dehumanization is the only or the dominant type of dehumanization that is explicit and blatant. And the second one is that Asians do not face a very prominent degree of blatant dehumanization, at least compared to Blacks, Mexican, and social groups, as we saw here in earlier slide. In this paper, we contend otherwise. In particular, we argue that Asians and Blacks experience dehumanization in different ways. And we argue that Asians are more mechanically dehumanized, whereas Blacks are more animalistic dehumanized. And we also contend that both of these types of dehumanization can be blatant. There is already some evidence for our contention from past studies. Asians are perceived to be lacking sociability and are prone to suppress emotional expressions. And there is also a widespread perception that Asians are efficient, but lack interpersonal warmth, and capable of thinking, but not feeling. And these perceptions dovetail with the conceptualization of mechanical dehumanization, but in contrast, the stereotype about Asian people are incongruent with the concept of the animalistic dehumanization. In contrast, Blacks are perceived to be socially savvy, athletic, or even virulent like ape, but they are intelligent, incompetent, incapable of emotional regulation and self-control. And this stereotype and perception of Blacks suggests that Black people are perceived to be similar to animals, but not machines. And with these theoretical considerations, we proposed and tested a symmetry of racial dehumanization. The symmetry consists of these four pairs of comparisons. In particular, Black people are animalistically dehumanized more than Asians are animalistically dehumanized. Asians are more mechanically dehumanized more than Black people are mechanically dehumanized. And furthermore, Black people are more animalistically dehumanized than they are mechanically dehumanized. And finally, Asians are more mechanically dehumanized than they are animalistic dehumanized. And we test these 4 comparisons in studies 1 through study 4, and we investigate the implication of this symmetry in study 4 and study 5. In study 1, our pilot study, we wanted to gather initial evidence for our hypothesis, so we asked the white participants to rate the degree to which they believe that Asians and Blacks are similar to different things. The average, the similarity to artificial intelligence, and the calculator are the operationalization of mechanical dehumanization measure. The average, the similarity to chimpanzees and ape are the animalistic dehumanization measure. Glass and plastic, they were just there as distractor items. To verify the measure is capturing dehumanization as a negative evaluation, we looked at the correlation between the measures with feeling thermometers. And as I show here, the correlation is negative. So these measures indeed reflect a negative attitude. And as we're already on this page, we did the same thing for the measures we used for other study, and we found the same thing. So you put it in a different way, our measures are indeed measures of prejudice, and they are not positive evaluation anyway. So this is the t-test we did for study 1. And these are the comparisons corresponding to the symmetry. In particular, we see that Black people are animalistic dehumanized more than Asian people, right here. And Asian people are mechanically dehumanized more than Blacks, as shown here. And furthermore, Blacks are more animalistic dehumanized than they are mechanically dehumanized, shown in this blue bar. And finally, Asians are more mechanically dehumanized than they are animalistic dehumanized. So showing this yellow bar. So again, summarized in the table, we have the preliminary evidence for this symmetry. In study 2, we measured dehumanization in a different way. Animalistic dehumanization was measured using the classic scale from Nortilli et al. Participants were asked how evolved different social groups are compared to our ancestral primates. And since there is not a corresponding blatant mechanical dehumanization measure, we came up with one ourselves. Both measures, this one and this one, they were reverse coded so that a higher score will mean more dehumanization. Reviewing the results, we're seeing the evidence for the symmetry that we're proposing in most of the cases. The only exception is the one right here. So that is a comparison of an animalistic and a mechanical dehumanization of Black people. This one is not significant. However, this comparison will become significant if we mean center the variable first. Summarizing a table, we see that the pattern from study 2 is very similar to that of study 1. So overall, we found additional evidence for the symmetry hypothesis. So now we know that people have a dehumanized perception of Black and Asian people, and the way that that people dehumanize them is consistent with the symmetry we're proposing here in the paper. But do Black and Asian people experience these two types of dehumanization in the way that is described in our symmetry? So to answer that question, study 3 asked the participants who are Black and Asian to first learn about the concept of dehumanization, and they learned that using the material right here. We then asked them to rate to what extent they feel different racial groups experience animalistic dehumanization and mechanical dehumanization. And in particular, we asked, well, in the study, we're looking at Asian participants' response to the question about Asians and Black participants' response about the questions about Blacks. And we also asked to what extent participants feel that themselves are experiencing animalistic dehumanization and mechanical dehumanization. Looking at the results here, we again found that there's evidence for the symmetry. In the study, Black participants reported that Black people experience more animalistic dehumanization than the mechanical dehumanization. And they also say that they themselves experience more animalistic dehumanization than mechanical dehumanization. Now, looking at the result for Asian participants, Asian participants said that Asian people experience more mechanical dehumanization than animalistic dehumanization, and they themselves also experience more mechanical dehumanization than the animalistic dehumanization. So put it together again, we found the evidence for the symmetry I was talking about earlier. All right, so far we have some evidence that support the idea of this symmetry, but why does it matter in any way for the real world? In study 4 and 5, we investigate the implication of this symmetry. Study 4 has two main goals. The first one is to see if the symmetry has any implication for romantic relationships. Specifically, we seek to answer this question. And do two types of dehumanization predict the romantic attraction for Black and Asian people differently? And the second goal of the study is to replicate the racial symmetry we found in studies 1 through 3 so far. For the design itself, we asked participants to respond to the pictograph scale from the study 2. And then we asked the participant how much they prefer to engage in sexual relationship with people from different racial background, and how much they are willing to marry someone who is from different racial background. The results are linear regression models. We use the two type of dehumanization measures to predict people's romantic preferences for people in that racial group. We also consider participants' sex and its interaction with dehumanization in the model. On this slide, what you see is that the animalistic dehumanization can predict the lack of a sexual interest for Black, but not for lack of a sexual interest for Asians. In contrast, the mechanical dehumanization can predict lack of a sexual interest for Asian, but it doesn't predict anything for Black. We then look at the marital interest, and we saw similar pattern with the just a one minor exception. So right here, the animalistic dehumanization is also predictive of a lack of marital interest in Asian people. Nevertheless, if we compare the coefficients here, we see that the coefficients for the Asian one is much smaller than that of the one for Black people. So as such, the data overall here suggests that the symmetry does have a practical implication, as the way that Black and Asian people are undermined on the dating and marital market reflect that symmetry that we're proposing. To fulfill the second goal of replicating the other studies, we did the same set of t-tests that I presented in study 2, and the result is pretty much the same as the other studies. So it is, again, supportive of the symmetry hypothesis. So that was study 4. And finally, we look at the symmetry's implication in organizational context. In particular, we look at if the symmetry can be translated into biases in employee promotion. In study 5, participants read about a employee, and then they decide which one of the two positions to promote the employee to. And the promotion decision is our primary dependent variable. In the experiment, the position A is a position that requires traits that are animalistic, and position B requires traits that are mechanical. Candidate's race is either Black, Asian, or white, and candidate's sex is either male or female. But candidate's sex in the study is theoretically treated as a random variable because we don't have any prior expectation for it. The hypothesis is that Black employee is less likely to be promoted to the animalistic job relative to Asian. So the expectation is that there is a race by position interaction. To give you an idea of how the study looks like, this is the description of the position that participants were given. And this is the description of the candidate. And as I mentioned earlier, the race and gender, they were manipulated across the conditions. And to test the hypothesis, we did a log linear analysis. And as you see, there is a race by position interaction right here. Looking at the graph, we see that Black candidates are less likely to be promoted to the position that needs the person to be not like an animal. So that was study 5. So overall, we know that the tendency to dehumanize racial minorities has captured the researchers' attention in a lot of past studies. However, the popular operational focus on animalistic dehumanization has belied the subtlety of how different racial groups are dehumanized differently. And this gap in the literature prompted the assumption that animalistic dehumanization is the only type of explicit and blatant dehumanization. And Asian people as a minority who are usually regarded as the model minority are relatively immune to it. In light of this, we proposed and found evidence for a racial symmetry of dehumanization such that Asians are primarily mechanically dehumanized and Blacks are primarily animalistically dehumanized. And these two forms of dehumanization have practical and real-world implications. And focusing on the domain for romantic attractions and the employee promotion, study 4 and 5 show that the racial symmetry in the two types of dehumanization may have a very probable and practical consequences. And with that, I will close the talk by thanking all of you for your attention. Thank you.